Look at that door, dude. See that door right there? One marked pirate. You think a pirate lives in there?
I see a door marked private. Is that the door you're talking about?
No, I was talking.
Yep.
I didn't say.
No,
did you? What did you hear?
I heard you say you saw a door marked pirate.
Yes,
and is there a
that's what I was
pirate
talking-
living in there?
No, see, that's not what I was saying. Well, look, are we going to talk about pirates all day? We're going to find out what lives in here.
You're the one that...
You're listening to Binnall of America Audio.
What is going on up here?
All right, now you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but I think it's important to discuss, and that's sort of this disconnect between the pilots, the intelligence people on the base, and the higher-ups who wanted the reports. And the intelligence people seem more often than not to ridicule the pilots when they came back, or, as you said, accuse them of drinking, or all sorts of foolishness. And it's sort of a strange scenario here, because the guys on the bottom of the rung, the pilots, they were interested in what happened, and the people at the top were interested, but the people in the middle sort of, they kind of poo-pooed the whole thing. Talk a little bit about that culture, I guess you could say, that was going on at the time.
Okay, well, first of all, at the squadron level, when the men were coming in from their missions, you can imagine the horror. They were dealing with people, their friends dying. They were dealing with a lot of horrific sights. They were scared to death. They were in close combat with other aircraft. So they were coming in and in a lot of cases talking to their buddies who happened to be S2s or A2s, which were squadron-level intelligence people, to take the report, interrogate them, calm them down, try to extract as much information as possible so they could collect, correlate all the reports and put some type of picture together. So at the squadron level, you think, okay, what's going on here? In a lot of cases, the intelligence officers just didn't believe it. When they heard these wild stories and these incredible stories, one thought, well, the guy was scared. He misidentified something. He saw something that just wasn't there. Out of fear, he hallucinated. And so you have that, but at the same time, you'll have scenarios where the S2 officers, for some reason, at the squadron level, would act as if it was nothing. They were hearing something. Some of these men would give them stories that came out of the annals of science fiction, yet they were like, that's fine, took the report, but act nothing, no questioning, nothing at all. So you suspect that, well, were these intelligence officers at the squadron level informed by the different commands to handle the reports differently? So we have an array of reporting systems. We could look at it in several ways. One, let's say it's Bomber Command, and they have their unit intelligence officer interrogating the people. And the unit intelligence officer starts to ridicule the bomb crews. Well, the first thing that's going to happen is the bomb crew people are going to resent it. They're going to be fearful of being grounded because they didn't want to have to go for psychological analysis. And so they're going to shut up. Well, the higher commands realize, well, they shut up. We're not going to get the intelligence data we need. So don't ridicule them. But then you'd have other commands who may have said, look, we know what's taking place. Take the report. Keep quiet. Don't say anything. Don't offer any information. Take it. Get it to us immediately. Of course, that's speculation on my part. But when you look at the reports and you look at throughout the war how this was being handled, then you say, well, why is there no set standard for taking these reports? And, of course, I think we're just dealing with human factors here. The great example of that was during a 1942 sighting, and where I have a quote from this would be number 5 group to Bomber Command relating to a pretty incredible sighting. And December 3rd, 1942, and it says here, this went to the Bomber Command. Herewith a copy of a report received from a crew of the Lancaster after raid on Turin. The crew refuses to be shaken in their story in the face of the usual banter. And that's official documentation. So that shows that for some reason the RAF crews were being harassed and ridiculed. Some people thought they were drinking. So it just, to answer your question, that's a mystery that I need to further explore, because since there's so little documentation that shows that, I have to assume a scenario and then investigate it in that light to see what comes forth.
Yeah.
But right now, it's just, you pick the unit, you might find different ways.
Mm-hmm.
So.
nowadays, like, when the military type folks see UFO and they tell their boss or whatever, oftentimes it comes back where they're like, they take the information and they're like, shut up about this, don't tell anybody. It doesn't seem like that was really the case during World War II. Did that happen very often, or did it develop over time during World War II, or, was it just like you said, dependent on what different branch you were at?
Yes, there were cases. I can, off the top of my head, I think I can think of two. One case was where the unit that actually named the Foo Fighters, the 415th, Harold Augsburger, Major Harold Augsburger was the unit commander for the 415th station in France of the Night Fighter unit. And at one point, he was told and heard through his operations officer to drop the subject. It was a classified situation. So there in itself, that was pretty much don't pursue it.
Yeah.
As far as the pilots and crews themselves, no. I've heard stories, but I'm not sure how accurate those stories are. But generally, no. There was nothing that, don't talk about this. They really wanted the intelligence to come in because, the primary situation was there was a war going on, a heavy-duty situation with Germany being very advanced, and they knew they were going to be encountering some pretty incredible things, such as jets and rocket-propelled aircraft.
Yeah. All right. Now, I cherry-picked some of the key cases I thought stood out, and we'll just sort of hit on these, and feel free to add as much detail as you want. Let's really dig into some of these key cases. And I guess the first one, and I just went by the names that are affiliated, I guess you could say, with the cases. So you'll know which ones I'm talking about, I'm sure. And the first one is the Sabinsky case, which is really the first big one, it seems, where there was shooting at the objects and all sorts of crazy stuff happened. So why don't you talk about the Sabinsky sighting or case first, and we'll talk about that.
Okay, to me that is probably the key to this date, early war sighting. Now, the problem is there's no official documentation. However, we have Sabinsky on tape relating his story. And I, for one, am not going to call someone a liar or disbelieve them. And hearing his testimony on the whole encounter is just something remarkable happened. And it took place on June 25th, 1942. And Captain Sabinsky was a Wellington bomber pilot. He was with a Polish division attached to the RAF. And he had been going into Germany over the Ruhr Valley because that was the industrialization area of Germany on a bombing mission. Coming back, he was out over Holland heading into, I believe, the North Sea. And coming up on the rear of the aircraft with a round, shiny object. It was copper-colored, solid. It looked as if it was like a setting sun color all the way through. And it was the size of a full moon. So this object came up on the aircraft, and of course Sabinsky said, well, this is something, a rocket, whatever it is coming after us, is going to attack. So he let it get fairly close to the aircraft, I believe several hundred yards, 200 yards or so, and told his men to open up. And so two of his gunners opened up simultaneously on this object, and the remarkable thing that they witnessed was that their tracer rounds were entering the object. They were sure of this because of the two guns meeting at one point, and they weren't exiting. They weren't going through it. They weren't bouncing off this. They were just disappearing into this object. So that startled them, of course. After a while, the circular object jumped from one wing over the aircraft to the other with remarkable maneuvering capabilities, and they fired into it again, and it shot off. It took off, and so they were pretty startled. When they got on the ground, they reported it, and the first thing out of the intelligence officer's mouth was, "You were drinking." So they shut up because Sabinsky knew not to push an issue like that. And so Sabinsky decided to do some of his own investigation, and he asked one of the bomber crews who had come in a few minutes after he did, and indeed, that crew too saw the object, encountered this particular object, and they chose not to report it. But Sabinsky and his crew did, so that report disappeared into the black hole of great documentation that should exist. So that, to me, was one of the key early war to show that, okay, if this was June 25th, 1945, okay, possible experimental aircraft, who knows what, but you can at least give it some type of, okay, there's more that it might be. They just misidentified. But this early in the war, I don't see how Germany had any type of rocket capability, even though they had rockets that could do and perform in that manner. So that to me was a very key case to start off the whole book.
And I guess before I go to the next one, as the war went on, these strange sightings became sort of like people knew about them, I guess you could say, the pilots and stuff, and, it wasn't a big surprise to other pilots, I guess, when it happened to, their friends or whatever. But when the Stavinsky case happened, how prevalent were these strange sightings? Was this really out of the ordinary, or was it sort of like, the guy came back and he was like, hey, I saw it too, type of thing?
To my knowledge, it was pretty out of the ordinary. That, of course, is just limited to my knowledge of the subject. How many veterans went to their grave or still are holding on to this information from that period? That's the problem. Because, like I said, the ridicule that they were receiving in the early war generally was, they didn't like the repercussions of that. They didn't like to be looked at. They were on an honorable mission to conduct combat against the enemy, and the last thing they wanted to do was report something that was really out of science fiction magazines in terms of anything else that the Allied air forces were aware of or knew of, or how could something, how could you possibly shoot at something with two machine guns and it doesn't affect it and it sucks it up like a black hole?
Yeah.
You didn't see that correctly. That was not something you saw. It was farther away than you realized. There's no way a rocket could jump over from one side of your aircraft at an extraordinary speed. There must have been two. So you can see how that would have happened and why that would really have scared a lot of the crews from reporting the greater sightings.
Yeah. And then the next case you kind of touched on already, but I guess we'll delve into it a little more, and that's the Stuttgart Schweinfurt series, I guess you could say, of cases. And it's the only case where a plane goes down via whatever the unknown anomaly is, and that seems to suggest it probably was some kind of flak or, defense, I guess you could say, by the Germans. And it also sort of highlights the key problem with the Foo Fighter phenomenon in that trying to figure out what's coming from the Germans and what's coming from, beyond Earth is really tough to do. And the Stuttgart Schweinfurt case really sort of exemplifies all that in one. So I guess talk a little bit about that and the downed plane and why you think that was probably ordnance and not something extraterrestrial or maybe a mix of both.
Well, if we can look at it several ways. For one, that series of events, we know that in the Mediterranean theater of operations, and then, of course, European, these so-called ordnance-related discs were being observed in the memoranda. So we're following, if we look at the picture here now through the eyes of the intelligence memoranda, they were saying it was ordnance, and they were putting the theories of what it might be because apparently they had recovered one of the objects, but that hasn't been proven yet. But the intelligence memoranda reflects that the ordnance aspect of this. And then, of course, you have these pilots who were seeing the objects fall from above. They were falling in a downward pattern, so that in itself seems like an aerial bombing. Something high up released it. However, they never could determine where the source was. They never could find the German high-altitude bomber or whatever to drop these things. Yet, in the state of combat, I could see how a high-altitude aircraft may not be seen, especially when you're not looking for it and it's been dropped and the thing's has moved on, the aircraft itself. So there were several, what they saw, glass balls, a silver disc, and there were things called rods that were, it was an aerial ordnance. They were trying to come up with any way they could to screw up the bomber formations because they were just raising hell with the industry in Germany. So it all made sense. But what doesn't make sense is you will get other reports, not in the intelligence memoranda, that said that they saw these discs or these silver balls or these glass balls or whatever they were that were huge. So, there are some cases where they were very large. They maneuvered in towards the aircraft and moved out. So here again, I think we have a situation where several types of phenomena were being seen, ordnance and possible unconventional aircraft or flying saucer, whatever. And that is the problem. But the significance of the two bombing raids, the Stuttgart and the Schweinfurt of 1943, is that the term flying disc or disc shape was now in the memorandum. And because of that, you have a pilot reporting something, oh, I saw one with a silver disc. Well, they just assume, oh, the ordnance. Well, that guy could have seen a silver disc hovering out in the distance, and it was actually an aircraft, but they just threw it in there.
Yeah.
And this is where the controversy arises. But I would say most UFO researchers today consider the Schweinfurt and the Stuttgart the ordnance-related aspect. However, we have to be careful and not discount some of the reports due to the fact that they may have been seeing something very unusual in addition to.
The one plane that went down because one of the things, the phenomenon or whatever it was, fell on the wing of the plane and the plane went down. They lost a guy. You think that's ordnance-related?
Yes, that it seems to be absolutely. And, of course, the report that came out of it gave a very brief description, so I never did find the report of the downed aircraft or who that was, or that remains to be discovered. And it seems to me that just to look at it through the eyes of ordnance, okay, if something's falling out of the sky to disrupt your engines, such as we know with the confetti flak, they thought that that's what they were going to try to do, suck it into the engine, shut it down, or just dropping debris out of the sky just to hit these aircraft. Well, one aircraft gets hit, he falters and crashes into another and just raise havoc. These were situations, but I don't have any reports from the German side. I don't have that, oh, we did indeed drop these discs. We don't have that. Or if it exists, I haven't discovered yet, or I'm not aware of it.
Yeah.
That's again, is the mystery.
Part of the reason why it probably stands to reason that it's ordnance is that in the whole vast collection of reports here in Strange Company, there's no real reports of hostility by the Foo Fighters or aerial phenomena or, what we would term as UFOs. So it seems like that they were non-hostile, so it wouldn't make much sense for them to down a craft.
Exactly. If it was an aircraft or a drone, that means it's a suicidal type of thing. But if you go to the Pacific, they had crazy things they were seeing, such as they called them in the memorandum fire extinguishers, balls and chains, egg crates, and these things. There were just different objects just to raise havoc. Actually, two balls with a chain, so that chain would wrap around the propeller and stop it working. So they actually saw that. So if you look at the Pacific War, what the Japanese were doing, and go back to Stuttgart and Schweinfurt, you say, an attempt to knock those planes down.
Yeah.
And they were, Germany was just having a hell of a time with that, trying to keep that at bay, because they were, they couldn't afford to lose industry, so they had to go underground. What happened at the end of the war because of that.
And the next key case I wanted to mention and point out was the Leet case. And as you say in the book, that's the first case of which that mentions heat coming from the object. The pilot saw an object and he experienced some intense heat. Talk a little bit about the Leet case and how important that one is.
Okay, so we're moving on to 1944, and that's November 24th, which is a good date because this was over Italy, Trieste, Italy, I believe it's called, and it was Captain William Leet with the U.S. 15th Air Force. Captain Leet and his crew were on a lone wolf mission to bomb a target in Salzburg. A lone wolf mission meaning one aircraft, run at night, hit your target, and run. Just a harassing situation. Just give it up. And it also gave the pilots an ability to accumulate another mission to get them out of there. After 25 missions, they were gone. No more flights. And that was if we can make it, but it was very rare that you could hit that. So they were on their way home, and coming off one of the wingtips with a perfect circle, yellow in color, and they were out over the Adriatic Sea. And for 50 minutes, this circular object was about 10 feet in diameter, what they thought, paced their aircraft. And at one point before it disappeared, as it zoomed away, one of the crew members, I believe a ball gunner, I'm not sure, felt the heat of the object. And so it was disappeared in the distance like a light switched off. And that is the first time there's actual physical reports of an encounter. But unfortunately, the report does not exist. But what is key with this case is William Leet became a huge proponent in MUFON. He was I think, a state director or assistant state director. He became very good friends with Richard Hall. And before his death, up to that time, he was a big proponent that we were dealing with extraterrestrial aircraft.
Yeah.
And, of course, he had reported that to his intelligence officer, who, by the way, did not ridicule him, but treated in shock, like he could not believe it, because they knew for a fact there were no searchlights, which were a real problem, and there were no anti-aircraft defenses of any real means in that area. So for him to encounter something like that, it really shook, according to Leet, the intelligence officer who he told it to.
Wow. And then the last case I have here that I have written down for key cases, and then we'll get into some other ones that you think are important. The last one here I have on the list is the Len Stringfield case. A lot of people probably don't know that ufological legend Len Stringfield, they probably maybe know that he was a pilot in World War II, but maybe they don't know that he had a Foo Fighter sighting. So, and there were some significant elements to his sighting. Let's talk about Len Stringfield's sighting and what those significant elements were.
Okay, well, what's significant about Len Stringfield's sighting was that it was August 28, 1945. The war was over, both the European and Japanese theater of operations. And so the Allied air forces had complete air superiority. So the key thing about Stringfield's sighting is he was with the intelligence capacity with the 5th Air Force. And Len was some of the first men to fly into the Isugi Aerodrome in Japan to prep it for the invasion of Japan in November. So he was, after the bombing of Nagasaki, he was with the first group of air intelligence to go into the air base, set it up, and everything else. He was flying out over open ocean between the islands of Ieshima and Iojima in a C-46 aircraft, and he was looking out the window, and out from a cloud bank during broad daylight were 3 teardrop-shaped, what he assumed were intelligently controlled aircraft that looked like glowing magnesium come out of the cloud bank and approach the aircraft at a distance, he said, of holding a lot of the World War II veterans say this, holding a dime up at arm's length.
Yeah, I noticed that in the book.
So it was interesting he said that, but that's what he saw. No problem. Very mystified by the the sighting. However, about that time, the aircraft started experiencing mechanical malfunction. He heard a lot of commotion in the cockpit, didn't understand what. The co-pilot came back and said, prepare to ditch the aircraft, prepare for ditching, which scared the hell out of him, according to his story. He said that he then noticed that about that time, it was only, I guess, a few moments that those 3 aircraft went back into a cloud bank, and his aircraft then regained control. Well, they made an emergency stop at Iojima, and he got out of the aircraft and noticed that the left wing had leaked oil all the way down the side of the aircraft. So he wanted to try to interview, or at least ask the pilots what was going on, but they had been whisked away for debriefing. And he had things he had to do according to his assignments, and was not able to do that. Then he made his way back to, of course, the Isugi Aerodrome. He never did find the pilots. He never did find out what happened to the report, if any. But it was a very significant report because we now have an engine malfunction which seems to be associated with those aircraft.
Yeah.
To that day, till the day he died, this is according to Richard Hall, because Len never told me this, that he would never fly again. When he got out of the service in November 1945, he never flew in another aircraft because of that event.
Wow.
He just took mass transportation. And then, of course, as we all know, or people new to listening, he devoted pretty much the rest of his life to UFO research.
And what are some of the other key cases you think bear mention here from the book and from this period and era in ufology and the Foo Fighter era?
I'd say some of the key cases early would be August 5th, 1942, which was a sighting by a witness on the USS Helm destroyer off the Solomon Islands, and this was in preparation for the first of the island hopping campaigns. Those islands included Guadalcanal, so you can imagine the severity of what was going to be happening to the Marines coming ashore. The fleet sat offshore. This is August 5th. I believe the actual island campaign started on the 7th. And coming in on the fleet was a silver-colored, and this is the first time that a cigar-shaped object had been reported. towards the fleet. The fleet completely opened up. The object was within range and circled the fleet, and no hits. But what's incredible about this is not only the first silver cigar-shaped object was that, according to personnel on the USS Helm, it was clocked at over 10,000 miles per hour.
Wow.
Departing. So, once again, this was reported by the ship's captain because they couldn't break radio silence at that stage of the game. So he assured the crew, according to this witness, that he would contact air intelligence to determine what they encountered. And word came back, and according to his captain, it was not Japanese or German. And that's the last he heard of it. And of course, this report came after the war by the witness. So we are missing that type of documentation. However, it's significant in that it started the silver-colored cigar-shaped objects that we saw later in the 50s and 60s appear on the scene. Another key case was over Turin, Italy, in November of 1942. RAF squadron, Captain Lever, was on a mission and looked out about 200 to 300 feet in length with an object traveling what he thought to be around 500 miles per hour. And it had 4 red lights that were equally spaced along its body. That in itself startling because it had the appearance of no aircraft with wings. Now, was that a Zeppelin, and was it a balloon? Well, there was no reason for those two type of balloons or a Zeppelin to be in a vicinity of a combat zone. 2, the actual craft was seen earlier by another crew over Amsterdam that had been on the ground, came up and was traveling along the Alps. But this, it was able to travel at 500 miles per hour. It was maneuvering, and it was wingless. So it was actually just right there. So that is the case where they investigated that Bomber Command received that the crew refused to be shaken in the story of the usual banter. So that's pretty significant because that's our first official documentation that something very strange was seen. Air intelligence didn't believe it. So to cover air intelligence, but they had to state that we gave them hell. We told them they were seeing things they misidentified, and the crew would not change the story. So that's very significant. I guess the key sighting of 1943, which there weren't a whole lot that I have that were very significant. However, over the Ruhr Valley near Essen, Germany, and the Ruhr Valley again is the industrialization aspect of Germany. RAF pilot Gordon Cockcroft and his captain Ray Smith were flying a Halifax bomber where they saw a cylindrical object. It was silvery gold, and he described it of having several portholes that were evenly spaced along the craft, but it hung motionless in the sky as they went by. And as they approached, then it sped away at what he estimated at thousands of miles per hour. So I would assume that a pilot in those days could determine or could mess up when it came to a couple hundred miles per hour. But the fact that he said it was in the 1,000 miles per hour shows that it was so significant, it was beyond the technological aspects of any aircraft that he was aware of. Of course, he reported it to the intelligence officer, and when he did, it made no impression on the intelligence officer that he reported it to. And that really confused him. But he dropped it, and the official report doesn't exist. And then in early 1944, this, Captain Leeds' sighting was in November. Early in 44, there were 2 sightings in February of over Germany. One was over Germany near Aachen, and they saw a silvery cigar-shaped object. And the key thing here is terminology. And this was an official report. Like an airship. So the key here is like an airship. Not it was an airship, but like an airship. And it appeared to be a line of windows along the bottom of the object was seen. And that was also in the same another report in February of 44 over France. There were sightings of 3 silver objects, and the key point here is resembling Zeppelins, moving independently of the wind, and they weren't connected, so there was some type of individual control associated. Now, these 2 reports were in United States Army Air Force Intelligence Memoranda as per RAF Flak Liaison Officer reports, and these were officers who went up with the missions to observe the crew, the combat situation, just to determine if the crew are reporting accurately, and just another set of eyes that was not straddled with the aspect of, having to mount a machine gun or fly or watch the Navy. He was just there for observation purposes. So that's very significant. Then another very important sighting has been August 12, 1944, over southern France. And Brian Frow and Ronald Claridge, they had a sighting of an enormous disk that probably is 5 times the size of their Lancaster aircraft, hanging motionless in the sky, portholes along the side, and it sat there and then in an instant shot out of sight with no sound or exhaust. They reported it, and the intelligence officers were not interested. So this is 44, so we're starting to think, well, did that unit start to say, look, don't let on that you're worried about this, act as if there's nothing wrong, get that intelligence report to us. So that's what I'm assuming may have been taking place.
Yeah.
Then we have, of course, starting 2 days after Captain leaked, we have the sighting of the first official report sighting of the Foo Fighters, which was by the 415th Night Fighter Squadron. And for the next 4 months, a variety of sightings of single and multiple lights, some that just appeared out of nowhere, some that seemed to come from the ground, some that came from above. And it was definitely enough to completely mystify the unit. It was enough to bring somebody from Washington into the unit to investigate it, which was, of course, kept secret. They actually went up on a flight to try to see it themselves, but I don't believe that took place where they did see it. And Major Augsburger, who sighted it himself, he saw his, I guess, around December. He went up, and when he saw it, it was a light that came off the wingtip. And then after a while, it maneuvered with him. They couldn't maneuver around it. It was able to mimic their capabilities, and then it shot straight up into the stars to disappear. That startled him, and he started thinking, this sci-fi realm of it, because they just could not account for German technology, because they knew what the V-1 was. They knew what the V-2 was. ME-262s and ME-163s were on the scene, and within weeks, pilots were able to actually engage in combat with these because they knew the flight characteristics. They knew that the jet needed so much space to turn around, so they, being a single prop aircraft, they could just cut in on it and, actually engage it to some extent.
Yeah.
So those are pretty key. And then I guess one of the last signs I'd like to bring up is like March of 1945, and this would be the first time that a ground unit reported what I think were Foo Fighters.
Mm-hmm.
And this was between Mannheim and Darmstadt along the Autobahn. Infantryman John Norris was camped along a highway with his unit, and coming up parallel to the highway were 6 or 7 yellowish-orange circular objects. No sound. It was somewhat foggy. They were 3 to 4 feet in diameter. They acted independent of each other, traveling at about 10 miles per hour, and I'd say he said 150 feet or so in the air. Came along where they were bivouac, and then proceeded down along the highway silently. And it was very eerie, very different. So, one, we know it wasn't flares, the way that they performed. 2, they were traveling too slow to be aircraft of any known type. There was no noise, and of course, balloons don't operate in that type of manner.
Yeah.
Anything that would be applied that their intelligence people would say. Now, I have no idea what happened, but it wasn't just like he saw it. The whole unit bivouac there, so that report, too, is missing. So there's some great reports. Andy Roberts and Dr. David Clark in England are very instrumental in bringing about the Foo Fighter and the wartime reports in Britain by the Air Ministry, because they've done great work. And Andy Roberts was one of the first people, I believe, to do an in-depth investigation of the Foo Fighters that he ended up dropping. He just didn't pursue any longer. I believe Jan Aldrich and Barry Greenwood came up with some of the reports that they encountered in interviews, all interviews post-war. So you see these incredible sightings. You see some type of aircraft that today is being seen, cigar-shaped, cylindrical shape, portholes, able to hang motionless, able to travel at speeds beyond any known aircraft capability. So we can see how, indeed, the UFO of today appeared to be right with us in World War II.
And the next element to the story I wanted to get into was Bob Wilson, I believe Associated Press reporter, went over to Europe right around New Year's Eve. He wanted to fly into enemy territory or something like that as the clock struck midnight, and he had a big idea for a big AP story on that end. And, of course, it turned into something totally different, and it resulted in the explosion in the media of the Foo Fighters, and probably what we have to blame, I guess you could say, for the popularity of the name Foo Fighter and that sort of thing. I think that media explosion probably is why we call them Foo Fighters nowadays. I guess just share with us the Bob Wilson story and how that came about and the subsequent media explosion.
Okay, yeah, Bob wasn't true. He wanted to scoop that particular New Year's Eve. He wanted to get up there and be the first to report during a bombing mission over Germany, because there was much anticipation that the war was going to end fairly soon. They felt that since the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes offensive had been pretty much taken care of, Germany was now on the run big time. And so he wanted to be, of course, here we are. We are going to rescue Europe finally. And it was during that time a storm moved in, and it was too much fog or too much sleet or ice that they kept the night fighters on the ground. So he was with the 415th Night Fighter Squadron. Of course, he didn't know about the Foo Fighters. However, they played cards and they spoke well into the night. And they said, well, we'll give you a story. We'll tell you about the Foo Fighters. And he just sat there and listened about all these stories, because by then just about everybody had seen the Foo Fighters at least once. Some guys saw them 6 and 7 times.
Oh, wow.
And it became old hat. They laughed about it. It became a point where the guys weren't really scared of it. They were just like mystified by it. So he took that story and ran with it. And by the next couple of days, major press picked it up. New York Times was grabbing it, Tribune, Time, Newsweek started getting the story. So it really started to flurry. And of course, Foo Fighter was the key term.
Yeah.
And it was as if nothing ever else was seen. So that shows the censorship already with military and press, because there was very little, as what you would call aerial phenomena, that was released to the press at all. And because of that, the scientists and the engineers and the people back home started saying, well, this is what we think it was. We think it was remote-controlled devices, radar and or engine interference type of devices used, to either scare or take the aircraft down. They could have been magnetic devices that attracted to the aircraft just to play a cat and mouse to take the attention off of the combat mission. A secret weapon, hallucinations, optical illusions. And it was just like you read today. Someone sees a report, next thing you know, you get, okay, you may have seen this, but then you start to see maybe some character assassination, or really disregarding what that person saw. What was really a problem was night fighter pilots were the cream of the crop, or were very few in number. I believe 81 to 82,000 pilots were trained during World War II, American Air Force pilots. Only around 400 were night fighter pilots.
Oh, wow.
These guys they were flying by the seat of their pants. They were flying by radar, which was constantly under development. They were in a combat situation, and they were flying several hundred feet above the ground at times. Their mission was to go in to attack railroad stations, railroad cars, truck convoys, anything that had a light on it. So their vision was pretty good, and they were able to distinguish a lot. And they had to really have their factors together in terms of not overreacting, not panicking. And so they were a pretty brave, somewhat crazy lot. And so there they were, and they were seeing these stories coming out of the press from guys back home, armchair researchers, armchair theorizers, and saying, oh, no, you didn't see that. You saw this. or it was that. And these guys were reporting things that they could see no physical craft behind. In some instances, they felt they saw sharp outlines of a craft, but they never saw wings. So that was confusing them. So they were sure that when they're looking out off their wingtip, and it's a foggy night, and there's something out there mimicking the flight pattern and the evasive maneuvers of their aircraft, and they're trying to engage it in combat, and they can't. It's more than them hallucinating.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, in some instances they picked it up on radar, but in most cases the radar operator could not find it, even though he was looking out the window right at it. And they were sure it was not meteorological or natural phenomena, just because they were there to analyze it. But for those back home, there's no way that it couldn't be as simple as that. So in general, I think the military were determining that it was secret weaponry, and so the pilots were looking at it as that, even though they suspected otherwise, because it was too far of a leap for Germany at the time in that situation.
Yeah. Now, prior to the Bob Wilson story, was there really much national attention on the Foo Fighter story? Did anyone had it even entered the public consciousness yet, or was that really the first time that it sort of people had heard about it back in America?
That was the first time that term was ever even heard of, and pretty much that kind of story. I believe some of the ordnance-related, they call it the Christmas balls, they were glass balls, and the disc were reported and made headlines, very minor headlines, like in the New York Times, about strange Christmas-like devices seen over Germany. That could have been Foo Fighters. That was misidentified. The press didn't realize what was being seen, and they only had so much information. But the first time that the Foo Fighters and this phenomena took off in terms of that they were aircraft possibly was with the Bob Wilson story.
Yeah. Now, I got the impression that media explosion sort of only lasted a brief period of time and then it sort of died out. Is that accurate?
Absolutely. A couple months, it petered out. It was a flurry for like 2 months. And even then, it took the back seat to everything else that was going on in the war.
Mm-hmm.
So, and when Time and Newsweek released their story, it was literally a paragraph or two.
Oh, wow.
It was nothing.
Yeah.
It was just, here's what our boys are seeing, and here's what the scientists are saying. And it just dropped. It just went out of the consciousness of the people.
Yeah.
There you have it, folks. That does it for this week's edition of BOA Audio Season 3. Big thanks to Keith Chester for coming on the show and giving us so much time. Of course, he'll be back next week to finish up the conversation. I'll preview that in a little bit. If you want to find out more information on Keith Chester, unfortunately, he does not have a website, but you can pick up Strange Company Military Encounters with UFOs in World War II at Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, go to Anomalist Books, or go to your bookstore and order it. Go through any of those methods and you'll be able to get your hands on a copy of this fantastic book. Definitely check it out. I highly recommend Strange Company. Before we dive into the BOA Audio listener feedback mailbag, I should throw out a plug here. I did an interview this past week on Jeremy Vaney's Culture of Contact podcast. Definitely check that out. Moving right along now, it's time for BOA Audio listener feedback. And this week's letter is one that I discussed on my Culture of Contact appearance, but I only read a little bit of it, and I want to dig right into the whole text of the email here. This letter comes from Terry, no hometown listed. Here's what she has to say. Hi, I have a friend who claims to have some alien animals. He says they're ferret-like and friendly, and of course, they're invisible. He claims that he got them last summer, and they have been with him ever since. Since last summer, they have had babies, and now they're suddenly dying. He asked me to help him, and asked that I contact MUFON about this. And he says he needs help in keeping them alive. I don't know if there's anything to be done, or even if they're real, but I will do as he asks on the off chance they're real, and I can't see animals in pain. Please, if there's anything you can do to help, let me know, and I will pass it along. Thanks so much in advance, Terry. So there you go. Terry, thank you for writing to me. As I noted on Culture of Contact, when I originally read the email and responded to it, I didn't see the word invisible for some reason. It was actually invisible, I guess, to my eyes. So I wrote Terry back saying, if you can get a picture of the animals, send it to me, and then maybe we can figure out what to do about it. She probably thinks I'm some sort of jerk, so Terry, I apologize. I skimmed right over the invisible part and didn't even notice that. So I'm not really sure what to say. I guess we'll extend the call to help for the BOA audio listeners. If you've got some invisible alien animal care advice, definitely send it my way and I will forward it along to Terry. This is an honest-to-goodness email that I got, folks. Definitely one of the strangest ones I've ever received. Thanks again for writing, Terry. It's much appreciated. I'm sure the animals will be in good shape one way or another. If you'd like to be a part of BOA Audio listener feedback, there's two ways to do it. Either you go to binnallofamerica.com, click the contact button on the left-hand side of the screen. That will bring you to the BOA contact page with all of the appropriate information. Or you can simply write to boaaudio@hotmail.com. Either one of those methods puts your correspondence in the BOA Audio listener feedback inbox. Up next is the thanks portion of the program. Super huge thanks to the fantastic BOA staff for your help and support with the audio series and the website. Leslie, Chiron, R. Lee, Joe V., and Tina Senna, week in, week out, providing top-notch reading material for binnallofamerica.com. This past week at the website, Tina Senna wrote about her run-in with the blue light phenomenon when she was a kid. It's a very creepy story. It's very cool. Definitely check that one out. In Gray Matters, Leslie discussed the stark difference in press coverage between the UFO press conference from a couple weeks ago and the Richard C. Hoagland press conference from earlier in the month of November, and tries to come to some sort of conclusion about why there was such a big difference between the press coverage of those two press conferences. Following that, Chiron of the K-Files fame wrote about his personal experience with sleep paralysis. A very entertaining piece from Chiron, definitely worth checking out for anyone who's experienced something strange happening to them in the middle of the night. Chiron looks at it with his own special chironic point of view. So there's tons of stuff going on at the website aside from the audio you're listening to right this very moment. As we say, week in and week out here on the program, if you're only listening to BOA Audio and you're not reading the columns at binnallofamerica.com, you're only getting half the story. binnallofamerica.com, make it a part of your everyday search for esoteric news and opinion. Now comes the time, of course, where we ask for donations. Folks, this program is free of charge. It definitely costs me a pretty penny to make the phone calls to acquire the bandwidth necessary for all of our great listeners to be able to download the program, and of course lots of time and effort go into putting together the programs. We need your donations to keep BOA Audio and binnallofamerica.com in the black. We're hovering in the red right now. We'd like to get the program back in black, like the old AC/DC song says. How can we get it back in the black? That's simple. Through donations from great BOA Audio listeners like you. Here's how you do it. You go to binnallofamerica.com, click the PayPal button. It's either on the front page of the website or in the audio archive page. That'll put you on the road to making a donation, which will go towards making sure that the website and the audio series is freely available for all of our great listeners the world over. So, go to BOA, click the PayPal button, make a donation. It would be greatly appreciated. Now, I know last week we teased that we'd have the new merchandise up at BOA on Black Friday. We ran into a couple snags. The gist of it is, while an image may look really cool on your computer screen, when you get it into the shop and you start looking at it on merchandise, you start to notice little things that need to be adjusted. That's pretty much where we're at right now. In all honesty, I could have rolled the merchandise out on Friday, but I don't want to roll out crap. So my artist is working double time right now to fix some of the little mistakes and some of the little quibbles that I had with some of the images. We expect to have the new BOA line and the store for the BOA line up and running at binnallofamerica.com. Hopefully on Monday, possibly by the time you're listening to this, unless of course you're listening to it 5 minutes after I put it up. But if you're listening to this later on in the weekend, Sunday evening, or Monday, Tuesday, one of those days, hopefully we'll have the BOA store up and running and ready for you to check out the new merchandise and hopefully make some purchases. Alright, I've been yakking here, but we got one more part of the program to get to, of course, and that's the preview for next week. You already know the guest. It's Keith Chester, but this time it's part 2 of 2, And again, we'll be talking about Strange Company, military encounters with UFOs in World War II. Our conversation is going to continue as we discuss why the Foo Fighters probably weren't St. Elmo's fire, the relationship between Foo Fighters and radar, similarities and differences between Europe and Pacific aerial phenomena, post-war information gleaned about the Foo Fighters from Germany and Japan, and the potential for German UFO technology. We'll also delve into those big picture questions that we love here on the program, as we'll find out what Keith really thinks the Foo Fighters were as a whole, how the Foo Fighter phenomena fits into the theory that nuclear testing is what attracted the UFOs. What did the government really think the Foo Fighters were? Did they ever, and if so, at what point, consider that they were extraterrestrial craft? And the trials and tribulations of finding witness testimony to the Foo Fighter era. Additionally, at the end of the program, we're going to talk about Keith's mentor, Len Stringfield, and his role in shaping ufology. So we're going to get a little biography portion of the program at the end. As always, there's tons and tons more. I just scratched the surface there on that little preview. So come on back to BOA next week for more with Keith Chester talking about Strange Company, military encounters with UFOs in World War II. And on that note, we wrap it up for one more week. Thank you so much for listening, folks. Until next time, this is Tim Binnall, signing off.